that will need to happen inside the Zoom.
All right, everyone. Thank you for coming to our, third seminar series in this sequence. Today we have our very own director, Simon Dennis, telling us how on earth he ended up here and what he's doing. So thanks, Simon.
Okay, thanks, Andy. So I want to start by saying that I found this one of the most challenging talks that I've ever had to try to put together. So as you'll see, there's been quite a bit of stuff that I've gone through, and so I've had to make a lot of decisions about what was going to go in and what wasn't going to go in. But I just want to say there are a lot of people here and in the Zoom sphere that I've worked with, and maybe not everyone managed to get into the final presentation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that I don't value what we've done together. So in this talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about my work in human memory, but I'm also going to try and give a little bit more background about my kind of development more generally as a kind of person and my value set and so forth, and also hopefully a few insights into leadership, because obviously what I've been doing a lot in the last few years has been focused around that. So that might be ahead of some of you in your paths, but hopefully there'll be something interesting there for you. So as I mentioned, I've had quite a few, it's been a long journey, let me put it that way. So these are the different places that I've worked at various times.
It's not showing up.
Sorry. There we go. Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I've actually worked in many different places, and I guess one of the things that I would say if you're a young researcher is that this is not something that you necessarily want to emulate. So my wife and I have moved around a lot, and I think I was reflecting on why is it that we've had this many moves. And I think one of the things that has generated this is having a two academic family. So my wife's a full professor as well. And so there have been opportunities for me and there have been opportunities for her. And so that has tended to mean that, that we've moved a lot. When I was designing this slide, my daughter was looking over my shoulder, and she insisted that you might notice that the whole slide's not to scale or necessarily geographically perfectly accurate. In particular, Hawaii there is slightly larger than it is in reality. In fact, I've never been to Hawaii, but our cats have. So they had a mechanical breakdown at one of their planes on one of the flights, and so they had to stop in Hawaii. So Sophie said we really needed to include that as well. But this is just by way of saying there's a lot of, there have been a lot of moves.
Sorry, the screen sharing thing is showing. Move your mouse so that do it.
I don't know why it's doing that actually. All right. Because I'm clicking and I'm. All right,
whatever it is, what it is.
Yeah. So I'm a country boy. So the picture on the left there is a shot from our property out looking across Mount Tamborine in Queensland. And so I grew up on a dairy farm. And so there's me, there's a young Simon trying to herd the cows. And so I was in a very conservative, come from a very conservative background. So my family was basically the basis of the National Party in our area. And an area where there wasn't a lot of very educated people. So neither of my parents finished high school. My dad didn't go to high school, and so it was. You know, it's difficult. They've been extremely supportive, but it was always difficult for them to understand exactly what was going on. But yeah, I spent a lot of my early years chasing cows. There's a reason that bovine means not very smart, and that's because cows are dumb and they're really hard to get to move where you want them to go. So that was basically my early experiences. I also played a lot of tennis. So I was a state level junior tennis player. And later in my life, I coached tennis. That's not me, but that's the place where I used to coach. Yeah, you can tell it's not me because you notice that all of them have their front legs locked. That's very bad form. So that leg should be bent if you want to hit a good backhand. So, but nonetheless, this is the University of Queensland courts, and that's where I coached, mostly juniors and some seniors. And then I spent a lot of time at various different tennis tournaments when I was young as well. So this is on the left-hand side. There is the Milton Tennis Centre, and so I spent a lot of hours playing tennis there. And that was also, in fact, where I proposed to my wife. She said no, which was unfortunate. But you know, being the good data scientist I am, she was concerned that we were too young, and so I consulted the Australian Bureau of Statistics figures on this to determine what the average marriage age was in Australia, and it turned out that we were already over that age, and so when I made her aware of that, she changed her mind. So that's how we do things in our family. So I was in not a small school, but very much a country school. And so that creates a certain context. You're not necessarily, there's not a lot of people who are on an academic track in that environment. But there were a few things that probably made me stand out. So in 10th grade, I ran my first memory experiment. It was a free recall design. I manipulated the kind of similarity of the different items, so semantic, phonological, and control lists, and I was interested in what I would now call the degree of interference that occurs between items in memory as a function of the nature of the similarity of the items. This received an honourable mention at the Science Teachers Association of Queensland conference, so I guess that's my first publication. I had to go to the conference and present and so forth. I was also very involved in film. So that year I was the director of the Best Feature Film and also Best Documentary at the Queensland Student Film Awards. And then I got straight A's on my junior certificate, and I discovered girls. And so that would be a topic of intense study over the next few years. 12th grade, I was part of an international physics summer school, and that was my first introduction to going to a university. That was at University of New South Wales. And so that was really interesting, and I got to hear national and international physicists talking about their work. So very interesting. So I did well again, got perfect TAT score, edited the school newspaper, and perhaps something that would become kind of relevant later on is I started work on a kind of graph-based theory of knowledge representation. So this would have, I didn't know anything about the literature, but looking back on it, this is kind of similar to the structure mapping engine of Gentner and others were the kinds of thoughts that were going on then. At university, so I did a BSc in computer science, did honours maths and physics. After that, I did a BA in psychology, then I did my honours in computer science, and before moving on to my PhD. And I guess the other key part about what happened when I was in university is I started to take my faith much more seriously. So I got very interested in different forms of theology. And so, and there were two really kind of major themes there. So one was the kind of death of God theologians. So these John Robinson and Don Cupid, who were essentially talking about how do you have well, in their case, a Christian faith, but wasn't necessarily Christian, but how do you have a faith that doesn't deny science, but also recognises the value, the kind of values that are enshrined in things like the Christian tradition. And so, so that became important to me. I wasn't, you know, wasn't the kind of person that was going to be able to deal with a kind of supernatural faith, but this whole notion that you could have a faith that didn't require those supernatural assumptions, I guess, was kind of new to me, and that's kind of how I've reconciled my faith subsequently. And then the other key element for me was this was the idea of liberation theology. So liberation theology is a form of theology that puts the poor at the centre, essentially. And so it's, you know, at that time it was focused on places like South Africa, the Philippines, and in particular Central America. And so I became very interested in that, and that had some consequences down the track. And in college as well, I guess it was where I really started to understand what it was I was going to be doing with the rest of my life. And so I became really interested in this kind of notion of the unified theory of cognition. So this is something that Newell and Simon were talking a lot about at the time. So they had a system called the general problem solver, which was essentially a kind of recursive system for breaking down problems and figuring out what actions you were going to do in order to complete some kind of task. And so I thought this was pretty cool because it was embodying this kind of notion of how do people think, essentially? How do they solve problems? You know, in a kind of algorithmic form. And so so essentially that's been what I've been focused on ever since, really. So that whole notion of liberation theology and the kind of background that gave me, and the kinds of people I was associating with at the time, led me into a very kind of active phase where I was doing a lot of kind of being quite critical and of various different systems, and thinking a lot about how you go about changing those systems. So one example of that was in 1989, when Australia was engaged in these kind of military exercises in the top end, and they created a fictitious nation called Cameria. And basically this was a populous nation just to Australia's north. So you can kind of, you know, do you think anyone would guess who that might be? So there was these military exercises going on, and so along with the pastor, the Uniting Church pastor at the university, John Woodley, we set up a Camarian embassy in King George Square in Brisbane. And so that was a really interesting experience, because what we didn't know when we set up the Canarian embassy was that the Queensland troops were actually coming back from the operations that day, and they all had to go from the train station across King George Square in order to go on to their subsequent destinations. So we had literally hundreds of servicemen and women who came and kind of inundated this Camarian embassy that we set up. And so that was really interesting, because it was a real test, because, you know, when you're advocating a peaceful approach to things, what you can't do is get into violent arguments with people, right? So not only does it not work, but it doesn't really send the message you're trying to send, right? And but when you get a couple of hundred in a row, it can be pretty tough, right? So, but it was a good kind of testing ground for understanding how to keep calm and stay on message. a couple of years later, I went for a trip in Nepal, and this was a kind of walking, like a hiking trip for a couple of weeks. And so there were a couple of critical things that happened to me during that trip. So the first one is that I'd had glandular fever before I left, and about a week out walking, I got a recurrence of glandular fever. And so, which is not a good thing when you're hiking. And so, so what ended up happening is they kind of left me on the side of the hill with my tent, and while they kind of continued on with the rest of the hike. And so I was basically just there, kind of laid out, not feeling particularly well. But it was a good time for me to just kind of sit and think, and you're in the mountains, and it's a new experience and so forth. And so I was reading a lot, and I was thinking about my circumstances. And in particular, I became very fascinated by this book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And hopefully many of you have seen it. If not, I really recommend it. And it really gave me a sense of, you know, what is it that you know, what, how do I want to be inside, I guess, right? How do I want to feel, and what's my role in making sure that that's what happens? So yeah, so that was a really interesting experience. After a couple of days, I felt a bit better, and so I went up to, I walked back to this little tea house that we passed, and I met this guy there. He was a priest, and you could, a Hindu priest, and you could, you know, had the full regalia and so forth. But he'd actually finished an economics degree in India, and had walked from India up to Nepal to attend this particular ceremony. And so it was really interesting just to see, you know, how he integrated like Jesus and Christianity into his faith. It wasn't like a conflict at all. It was just, oh yeah, there's Jesus and he fits here in the whole picture and so forth. So that was really interesting experience. Now it was to get worse, unfortunately. So when we got back to Pokhara, so we were in the west side of Nepal and hiked out of Pokhara. And by the time we got back, the country had undergone a revolution. So there was the Nepali Congress and the United Left Front had joined together to overthrow the monarchy. And so when we got back, this was all happening, and so there was a lot of conflict. So the military had been kind of cracking down on these protests that had been occurring and so forth. And so this is the main square in Pokhara. And I remember being here, and there were students who were here kind of, you know, going through these, talking about the various different ideas that they had about how the government should work and so forth. And we were over kind of around about here-ish, I guess, and then down this way, the military was all lined up in ranks and ready to assert themselves on these protesters. And I was standing here, and I could, over in this building here, I saw the snipers go up into the top rooms at the top of that building, and we walked down this way at that point. But actually nothing happened in Pokhara that day, so that was good. But in Kathmandu, there had been a number of people killed, including Westerners. And we were actually locked out, so we weren't allowed back into Kathmandu, which was unfortunate because we left our passports there. And so we couldn't get out of the country. And so we basically had to wait it out. Fortunately, it didn't last very long. And so after a few days, we managed to get out. And then it took me, when I was coming back through customs in Australia, it took me over 2 hours to get through customs, because I'd been out walking for like 2 weeks. I had, you know, I was shaggy, and I had all these Nepalese things, and like the sickle and so forth across on the T-shirt that I'd bought from the revolution, And so they didn't think I was a very desirable character. So they searched everything in great detail. But yeah, anyway, it all went well for me, although Nepal has had a long and difficult struggle since then. So one of the things I thought a lot about when I was out on the sick on the side of the hill was my personal life. And so when I came back, that was when I actually proposed to Alison. So this is Alison over here. This is Sophie, my daughter. This one's Phoebe, little nugget. This is a slightly larger nugget. This is my little glam princess here. This is what she looks like now. This is Sophie on the bottom, Phoebe on the top. And Sophie's now off to University of Aberdeen, COVID permitting, and that'll be happening at the end of the year. So I'm not going to talk a lot about my family, but definitely major influence on what's happened to me. A little bit later, I went to Indiana University, and I spent time in Rich Schifrin's lab, so connection with Dan from last week there. And during that time, again, I was connected with Campus Ministries, and they, the pastor there, Maggie McNaught, had done a lot of work in Central America and organised a trip for us to go to Central America to basically an observation trip. So she'd spent a lot of time at Berkeley, and so we essentially had a group from Berkeley, a group from University of Indiana, and we joined up and went down for a trip that went through El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. And so it was a very interesting time to be in El Salvador in particular, because the peace accords, 1992 peace accords, had been signed just 2 weeks before we went. And so according to those accords, one was supposed to be able to travel freely through El Salvador and talk to whoever you like. So we decided we'd test that. And so we went up, so we drove up to this area where there had been some of the worst of the fighting, the ethnic cleansing that had gone on. And that was an interesting experience in itself, because the military basically lined up. They started doing patrols around us and so forth, as they were trying to make their minds up about whether they were going to let us go. And eventually they said no, and we had to go back. But it was interesting to be there and to feel the ambience of the place. We then went into Guatemala. There, it was a different set of dynamics, but it was still very violent. A lot of government-supported militia. We met up with 2 students there who were under death threats and had death threats on their families. And so we basically harboured them as they exited the country. So this is a novel thought now, but at that point in time, having been within a group of Westerners was actually protection, because the militias wouldn't want to take out a Westerner, because that would complicate matters in terms of their negotiations with the US or Australia, particularly the US. So so that was actually protection for them, and so they managed to exit the country without incident. But again, really interesting experiences to have. Okay, so that's kind of some of my personal background, to give you a sense of that. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about my work background. And so my PhD was done at the University of Queensland, and my supervisor was Janet Wiles, who's here. And so I was Janet's very first student. I was stuck in a room with the administrative assistant, because they weren't quite sure where her space was going to be. And so, it was an experience where I had to, I was very kind of isolated, particularly at the start, not so much at the end. But that was a good environment to think. And so one of the things that was happening at the time was that there was this connectionist movement, and people were starting to think about backpropagation, and how might backpropagation be a good model of human cognition and representation formation and so forth. However, we also knew that backpropagation had some very significant drawbacks as a cognitive model. And one of the key ones is that it's subject to catastrophic interference. So if you sequence two events, you learn about the first event. If you just keep learning about the second event, you lose what happened in the first event much more rapidly than what people ever would, right? And so that's a problem. It doesn't really represent, a model that could be a sensible model of human memory. So my thesis focused on this architecture here called the Hebbian recurrent network. And so the idea is very similar to a normal recurrent network, except so it basically uses backprop to create hidden unit representations here, but then they cycle back through here through a set of Hebbian weights, which are able to learn patterns in a kind of one-shot manner without this kind of iterative learning that's required by backprop. So there's this kind of distinction between learning and memory, that learning was the kind of slow process of gradual representation development. Memory was the fast process of capturing what happened in any particular event. So I did that and demonstrated it in some memory phenomena. I was also really interested in this idea of rational analysis. So this is the idea that the environment encodes statistics, which the cognitive system has been essentially optimized to. And so I was really interested in recognition memory, which on the face of it looks like it kind of really undermines this perspective, right? Because you see improved performance for low frequency things that you don't see very often, and better performance for high frequency things. You would think an optimization procedure should be optimized for the things you see most. However, one of the things that I pointed out in my thesis is that recognition memory is about having just seen something, can I say I just saw it within this context, right? So it's not in general have I seen it, but have I seen it within this context? So the real statistic you should be interested in is not to what extent is something high frequency or low frequency, but to what extent is it likely to reappear within a given context. And so it turns out that if you look at the likelihood of occurrence of an item, taking out function words, if you look at the likelihood of occurrence of reoccurrence of an item within a context and plot that against frequency, then it's actually the low frequency things that are more likely to recur within a given context. And so that kind of allowed a kind of rational analysis for something that seemed like a contradiction to that. Behind time, so I'm going to leave out the books for now. At the same time, I was working with Mike Humphries and Janet Wiles on a kind of generic theory of human memory. So we were interested in saying, there are all these different tasks that people use. How can we bring these together to understand what are the kind of fundamental representations that are required to underpin these tasks, and what are the kind of retrieval operations that you need. And so we came up with this theory that we published in 1994, which was essentially like a specification of human memory. So I think of it as doing a similar kind of thing to what Chomsky was trying to do with language, in that it was kind of specifying what are the different pieces and what are what has to be achieved by a model of memory. And so as opposed to necessarily being on the same level as what I was talking about before, we have this, where you're talking about the specific algorithms that actually generate the behavior. Here we're just trying to talk about provide a descriptive account of what are all the different things that the system has to do, right? And so that was kind of really interesting for me, because it kind of really got me thinking at the broader level about what does a full theory have to be able to capture. I then went into a series of postdoctoral research fellowships, and probably the major component of that was a model of recognition memory based on kind of context noise approach. And so this was developed with Mike Humphreys. Unfortunately, Mike died just a few weeks ago. So a very sad time. And is a very quiet guy, Mike, but very incisive thinker, and had a huge impact on my career. So here we were really starting to think about, what's the nature of the algorithm now that underpins different memory tasks. So we know, as I was talking about before, that recognition memory, low frequency words are better, recall memory, high frequency words are better. So, so what is it that generates that difference? And so one possibility, the one we were exploring, is this idea of context noise. That, as I was saying before, recognition memory is about isolating the context in which so you've got the item in front of you and you have to isolate the context in which that item has appeared, or isolate whether it appeared in this particular context. And so up to this point, most of the models had always assumed that what you were doing was isolating the words that were in the list, and then the key issue was, how does this word compare to the words that were in the list, right? So what we did is we turned it around and we said, okay, maybe that's not the issue, at least for recognition memory. Maybe what the issue is here's all the context that I've seen this word in. Was the study list context one of those contexts, right? And so when you do it that way, it becomes more obvious why the low frequency items should be better, right? So low frequency items seen in fewer previous contexts, therefore less interference, therefore you might do better in that particular task, right? Now that's a task where you're given the item and you have to find the context. In recall, you're given the context and you have to find the items in some sense, right? And so there you would expect a different kind of retrieval question. And so, so we kind of focused on that, and that became a key thought process going forward. So I also tried to start my own journal. This was a little bit of one of those things that seemed like a good idea at the time. But, I was thinking, the academic publishing seems broken, right? Academics produce the papers, academics review the papers, academics make the editorial decisions, and then the universities pay the publishers to give our papers back, usually with some errors inserted. So I thought, there's no way this system can possibly be sustained, right? Especially now that we've got the web and we can create our own. We're not kind of bought into a kind of distribution system and so forth. So I thought, this is ripe for disruption, and it can't be more than a year or two before the whole edifice will fall. Well, 26 years later, we're still waiting, but people are still talking about it, and we still have Elsevier. So, so that was really important for me. What I didn't understand was the culture, right? I didn't understand how the kind of reputational value that had built up through these journals over decades, and what, in particular, what I didn't understand was how big a deal it was going to be for people, for researchers who already had a lot invested in that system to shift to a new system. And so yeah, so that was a learning experience, and I published my PhD work there, which was a very bad mistake. But, from 1999, I became a researcher at a new centre, key centre, ARC Key Centre, called the Key Centre for Human Factors and Applied Cognitive Psychology. And so here I kind of went back to my computer science roots a little bit, and I was seconded to another centre called the Distributed Systems Technology Centre. We did a lot of work, kind of human factors kind of work. Developed my first business in that context. So we had something called Working Web, which was doing kind of human factors analyses of people's websites. And that I got my first patent at that point as well. And this guy here, Peter Quantis, was a postdoc of mine at the time. And he also became very influential later on. So he went, so he was Canadian, he went back to Canada and rose in the ranks in Defence Research and Development Canada and became a kind of very strong collaborator in that context. So now if you're paying attention, you might wonder, how does a guy with my background end up doing projects with defence? And I can tell you the early Simon probably would never have considered anything of the kind. But when an event that had, and I've done a lot of projects with defence, so I've had 6 grants from well, DSTO or DSTG, 16 with Defence Research and Development Canada and AFOSR and IARPA. So, so I've done a lot of these kinds of contracts. And for me, one of the key things was the US invasion of Iraq. And so at the time, I don't know how much some of you will remember this, but some of you won't. But at the time, there was a very strong, there was this whole exercise of trying to justify the invasion of Iraq. And in particular, Colin Powell was the Secretary of Defense for the US at the time, and he was charged with making the case for weapons of mass destruction, essentially, in Iraq. Now, yeah, I didn't agree with his conclusions. I didn't agree with the subsequent action that they ended up taking. But my read on Colin Powell is that he was a person of integrity, and that when he was making that presentation, I was convinced that he actually believed that that was the case. And so that got me thinking about, what does my skill set allow me to do that might actually make a real difference in cases like this? So clearly there was a breakdown in the intelligence, and I don't think it was anyone's fault necessarily that happened, but nonetheless it wasn't good enough. And so then that's what really got me thinking about, well, what is your commitment? Is your commitment to being anti-defence, or is your commitment to making sure that these kinds of actions don't happen again? Now, you can certainly be cynical about leadership, in the US and other places and so forth, and you can say, well, do you want to support those potential kinds of leadership? But at some point, if you really do believe that even if people disagree with you, there's integrity to be had, then you have to say, well, what can I do about it? And so that's the kind of the moment that I had. And so I started thinking about that seriously. Subsequently, we developed mechanisms for that were used in Afghanistan to understand the kind of psychological perspectives of people in Afghanistan and so forth. So, it was very briefly. I'm not sure it had any huge impact on what happened, but it did happen. Okay. So then I went on to the University of Colorado at Boulder, and I was working there with Tom Landauer and Walter Kinch, and that was a wonderful experience. And really what I did there was really focus back on what are the fundamental building blocks that are required in a unified model of cognition. And in particular, I started to develop this theory that I've been thinking about and working on called the symptomatic paradigmatic model. So back in that earlier paper I was talking about, where it was the behavioural and brain sciences paper where we were doing the specification, there we talked about two-way associations. We talked about the importance of three-way associations. So those are a couple of the building blocks that I thought you really needed to have in a system to understand cognition. But here I really started to think about, well, what else is there? What other kind of basic associations do you need? And so symptomatic associations are associations that occur, two-way associations that occur between items that have appeared within the same context. Paradigmatic associations are associations that occur between items that are interchangeable across different contexts. Okay, and developed a theory that was focused on those and have spent a lot of time trying to prove the existence of those since. I'm going to slide through some of these quickly because I'm running out of time, but spent some time at the University of Adelaide, really focused there on the context noise models. This is Michael Lee here, who was responsible for me going there. It's Ben Stone and Angela Cannell. Then I moved to Ohio State University and met up with Adam at that point. And we started working more on this kind of idea of context noise, but trying to expand it out and saying, okay, maybe there's context noise, maybe there's item noise as well. How can we think about that as a whole and come up with a much more comprehensive theory? So we built the COCO model, or Adam built the COCO model, and that, I think, in my mind at least, is very much the state of the art in memory models. Also worked with Vishnu Srikumar here and Hyung-Wook Kim, that many of you will know. So Hyung-Wook was very much focused on the developmental progression of those syntagmatic and paradigmatic associations. And then Vishnu started the work that has become very important to me now, which is thinking about how do we take this stuff out of the laboratory, right? So so I was very focused on context, but in the laboratory that means lists that we show you, right? But clearly, in memory it's obvious that the stuff that people have learned before they come to the laboratory is like 9/10 of the story, right? And so, so we needed to be able to get out into the real world and understand what was going on there before people came to the laboratory. But before you can even start to do that, you've got to think about, well, how do I collect data out there? How do I understand what context means out in the real world? All of these kinds of fundamental questions. So what you're seeing here is something called a recurrence plot. And so what that is, so we got people to walk around with cameras on their chests, and the camera would take photos at like 10-minute intervals. And then, so this was our kind of collecting data of, what does the experience look like for people out there. And so here what you can see, we've lined up all of the images on the x-axis, same images on the y-axis in chronological order. And then we color the intersecting pixels by how similar those two images are, okay? And so if you get blocks, contiguous blocks, where all of the images are very similar to each other, i.e. maybe you're in the same context, then you'll get black squares in this recurrence plot. And so you can see them here, right? So here's one context, here's another context, here's another context, and so forth. So now we're seeing the kind of shadow of those contexts out in the real world. We can start to measure and do other things with them. I mentioned before we did some work on information visualization that was used by the Canadian Defence Forces in Afghanistan. So I won't go into details there, but that's some of the work we did there. And basically this was dynamic visualization. So we've done there's a lot of work was done with kind of static spatial representations. Previously in Adelaide, we figured data don't work at all. So if you give people a list of documents and you give them these static representations, they actually do better with the list than they do with the static representation. So, so what we did here is we said, okay, what we need is projections of these representations so that you maintain the higher order structure. And so that's what that was all about. And that was a second patent that came out of that. I'm going to skip over here, but many of you will know that we have a company called Unforgettable Research Services. So all is focused on how do we get all of that data into do psychological research with. I think I'm going to skip over this as well, but I was head of school at the University of Newcastle. And so that introduced plenty of challenges. So my first day on the job, I had a sexual harassment allegation that I had to deal with. A couple. I had a staff member who was sleeping with one of his students. I had a physical assault case. So one of the staff members decided it was a good idea to go over. He was a clinician. Decided it was a good idea to go over to the house of one of his patients and physically assault her husband. So, so that was interesting. And I was also called as a hostile witness to the university by the at the Fair Work Commission. So we had someone who'd been dismissed. He called me into those things. So being a hostile witness to your own place of work is not that great. But probably the achievement that I'm most proud of here is that by the time I finished, we had 3 new female full professors. So we really managed to, having had none when I started. So, so that was a positive outcome. You've probably, a lot of people have heard what I'm most recently working on. So I'm going to go through and finish up with where I think we're at in terms of the developing a unified model of cognition. So when I look at the landscape from my kind of idiosyncratic perspective, I see 2 major kind of streams of understanding that are going through that I consider they're not really aimed at being unifying models of cognition, but they're what I would see as the best candidates that exist out there at the moment for something of this kind. And so the one that gets most of the press and has made the biggest kind of inputs is this kind of stream at the top here. So we've had back propagation, we've had short-term memory, and more recently we've had transformer models, which actually, if you look at them, look at the structure of transformer models, they're very, very similar to that heavy recurrent model I was talking about right back at the start. But this stream, I think, is, has been very successful, but there are a couple of issues that have never really been completely dealt with, right back from the back propagation days. And so the key problem I see is this notion of catastrophic interference. So the reason that these models can work is that they allow themselves to go through multiple iterations, or either multiple iterations or extremely large data sets of usually text in these cases, in order to be able to learn what's happening in the human system. But people just don't have that luxury. So people learn a lot from individual experiences, and an individual experience can cause someone to completely restructure their understanding just on the basis of that one experience. And that's something that, it's a subtle thing, but it's very fundamental to the way human cognition works, I think. And I just can't see a pathway for these kinds of models to get there, because they're really focused on small changes to weights over many, many iterations. Right? So what I want to argue is that there's an alternative pathway, and that's the one that I've been focused on, which also has a long lineage. So spreading activation models, interactive competition, activation competition models, construction integration, where instead of seeing it inference as a process of very small changes to lots and lots of weights and large amounts of data, what you assume is that you have some kind of network structure which connects concepts together and then you have some kind of iteration of activity over that network structure. So the difference here is that the inference that you're doing is all happening at the time of retrieval, or at the time that you're actually conducting the task that you're interested in, as opposed to putting all of the emphasis on encoding, right? And my feeling is that that's the right way to go. Now, it hasn't been successful. So you've got to, well, it hasn't been as successful as the other branch, certainly. But I think the reason for that is that we still have yet to figure out the right way to train these models. So the great thing about backpropagation is each of those individual weight changes is connected to a global understanding of the goal of the system, right? And directly through the map. We haven't yet got to that stage sufficiently with this other pathway. And I think that's where we need to get to. Okay, so I'm going to pass through a couple of more slides and do my last one. Sorry, I got to show this one. So just very quickly, this is a animation from Vishnushree Kumar, so one of my former students. What he's done here is he's implanted electrodes within people's brains, and then looked at the patterns of activity across time, and you get these so-called travelling waves, which I think is a really neat finding and something which is fundamental to the way we go about it. Where am I up to? Okay, real quick. So this is my best guess at what the unified model needs to look like. So we need to have something where we have a population coding of time. So as stimuli come in, they this is now really strongly supported by the neuroscience. So we have the most recent things in one set of units, the next most recent things in another set of units, and so forth, going back in time. That allows for all of these different kinds of associations, the paradigmatic in particular, symptomatic, and so forth. We then also have populations of units that are coding concepts at different time scales. So, so we have some short-term connections that are order independent, I suspect, and are happening over the scale of a sentence. We have longer-term ones that are happening over the scale of discourses. And then in between, we have this kind of hippocampal system that is putting all these things together, finding the kind of three-way and higher order connections that bind different stimuli together. And so that's kind of like super fast, but those are the key components that as I draw through all my experience, those are the pieces that I think we need to have in this kind of overarching model. But now, as I say, the challenge is how do we actually make all of that work together? Okay, so it's been a ride. It's been really exciting, and I still find it really thrilling to get up and try and grapple with these questions every day. These two pieces you may be familiar with. These are Salvador Dali's The Persistence of Memory and the Disintegration of the Persistence of Memory. I definitely feel like at this point in my career, I'm starting to get a bit closer to the right-hand side of the screen. But I guess what I would say is, as a kind of concluding remarks, so my career has been very much, I had a kind of burning issue, and then I kind of never really left it, right? And so there have been detours in different places and so forth, but there was always this kind of central thing. Now, people come up with careers in different ways, and so there's certainly diversity and etc. But I guess what I really want to do is I want to encourage people to think about what are those burning questions that are things that excite you and that unite what you do. Because I think our current incentive schemes and so forth, they really ask people to do kind of incremental work, right? They reward when people get that next paper out, when they get that next grant, when they get that next grad student, as if these are kind of tokens that are interchangeable in some kind of economy. And I would really encourage people to not give in to those forces, to say, no, there are important deep issues here. There's always a little bit of giving to Caesar, but you have to stay on track in terms of what that underlying burning purpose, noble purpose is, I think. And so I think I will leave it there. Thanks.
Time for one question.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, may I ask one?
Sure.
Just a question is, because you're kind of confusing about the PhD or research the whole difficult industry. Like, how do we balance the one exciting problem you mentioned in your heart with the reality of which also animation in this scenario, like competing findings and also like your labels like professor or all of this is actually so true that kind of would be us from doing that. So how would your harm balancing those points?
Yeah, so
Could you repeat the question?
yeah, okay. So I think I can repeat the question. So I think it's about how do you balance the kind of the necessities of the incentive schemes and getting a job and eating and some of those other things which are nice to do, and maintaining this kind of noble purpose and so forth. So I think one of the things that's critical, well, firstly, there's a responsibility for people in positions like mine to make sure that there are enough jobs in the appropriate, in the general sphere, so that so there's scope for more people to be involved in that. And so that's definitely part of what the company is about and so forth. How do we create a sustainable industry that is not just on the back of students to be able to provide opportunities for people? Beyond that, though, I think there's a certain amount of sales that you have to do in any job. And so one of the things that I think is important is to figure out what's the take on this, my noble purpose, which other people can really get on board with, right? So, so what I'm really interested in is semantic representation, episodic representation, how these things work together, how you learn them, and so forth, right? Now, what I was able to do, right, is I was able to convince people in the Defence Forces that that's what they were really interested in as well, right? And so now that pays out in terms of a specific interface. They've got to have something that they can show to their people on the ground and so forth. So you've got to go through the process of producing the interface, starting to interact with these spaces and so forth. But one of the things I found, so you've got to make that kind of sacrifice. But one of the things I found is that often that then leads you to another insight that you wouldn't have otherwise had in the pure realm, right? So once we started saying, oh, let's think about manipulating these semantic spaces and shifting them around, then we started generating lots of these semantic spaces and looking at them, and voila, certain things come out of that, right? So what started off as a way of paying the bills ended up as providing deep insights. So I think the key is to find those opportunities. Think hard about what those opportunities might be and how you might go about convincing people about that.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to stop now, but everyone, hey, can ask you other questions. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Lots of people in chat for a second.